The dust swirled around Rose Parker's worn boots as she drove her hoe into the unforgiving Nevada soil, her back aching from hours of labor under the scorching summer sun of 1878. The other field hands, all men, had long since begun casting sidelong glances her way, their whispers carrying across the drought-hardened farmland outside Truckee. Rose knew what they were saying. She'd heard it all before. "Ain't proper for a woman to be out here," muttered Sam Wilson loud enough for her to hear, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Should be inside doing women's work, not taking a man's job." Rose ignored him, continuing to work the row of struggling corn plants. At 22, she had developed a thick skin against such comments. After losing her parents to typhoid 2 years prior, she had taken over their small homestead alone. The neighboring Carson Ranch had given her field work when her own crops failed, and she wasn't about to let pride stand in the way of survival. "Look at her, pretending she belongs out here," another worker jeered. "Probably won't last the week." Rose wiped sweat from her brow with a sun-browned forearm and straightened her back, stretching briefly before returning to her work. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel her fair skin burning despite the wide-brimmed hat shading her face. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a practical braid, but loose tendrils stuck to her neck and cheeks in the heat. "That's enough jawing," called a deep voice from behind her. "Get back to work before I dock your pay." Rose didn't turn to look. She recognized Ethan Powell's voice, the foreman of the Carson Ranch and son of the owner. She'd seen him from afar, but had little direct interaction with the man. He was known as a fair but demanding boss who expected honest work from his men. The comments ceased, but Rose could feel eyes on her back as she continued working. By midday, her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to slow down. When the dinner bell rang, the men dropped their tools and headed for the shade of a large oak tree where lunch baskets awaited. Rose lingered in the field, taking a moment to catch her breath before following at a distance. "Hey, woman," called Wilson as she approached the tree. "This here's for the real workers. Why don't you go find yourself some mending to do?" A few of the men laughed, nudging each other. Rose's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin up and turned to walk away. "Miss Parker," Ethan's voice cut through the laughter, "your lunch is here with the others. I expect all my workers to keep up their strength." Rose hesitated, then turned back toward the group. Ethan Powell stood tall among the men, his broad shoulders squared beneath a cotton shirt darkened with sweat. His face was partially shaded by his hat, but she could see his strong jaw clenched with displeasure as he looked at the group. "Thank you, Mr. Powell," she said quietly, approaching the tree. Wilson muttered something under his breath and another worker snickered. Ethan's blue eyes flashed. "Something to say, Wilson?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Wilson's eyes darted nervously. "Just saying it ain't right, boss. Field work is men's work. Women ain't cut out for it." Ethan crossed his arms across his chest, looking at Rose and then back to Wilson. "Funny thing about that, I've been watching Miss Parker since sunrise. She works harder than any man here. Hasn't stopped once, while I've seen most of you taking breaks when you thought no one was looking." The men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding their boss's gaze. Rose felt her cheeks flush again, but this time from something other than embarrassment. "Miss Parker is paid the same as any of you, and she's earned every penny," Ethan continued. "Anyone who has a problem with that can collect their pay and find work elsewhere." No one spoke. Rose quietly took a seat at the edge of the group and opened her modest lunch of bread and cheese. The men gradually resumed their conversations, though noticeably more subdued. To her surprise, Ethan settled on the ground nearby, opening his own lunch pail. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "They're just afraid you'll show them up." Rose glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "I'm just trying to survive, Mr. Powell. Call me Ethan," he said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "And I respect that. Not many women would do what you're doing." "Not many women are alone with a homestead to maintain," she replied. "I heard about your parents. I'm sorry for your loss." Rose nodded her thanks, unused to such conversation with the ranch foreman. Up close, she noticed the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years squinting in the Nevada sun. He couldn't be much older than 30, but responsibility had matured him. "Your place is the small one just north of Owl Creek, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes, it's not much, but it's mine. You planning to sell?" Rose stiffened. "No, sir, that land is all I have left of my family." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "It's going to be a tough winter. The droughts killed most of the crops in the valley." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm here." They finished their lunch in companionable silence. When the bell rang signaling the return to work, Ethan stood and offered Rose his hand. She hesitated only briefly before taking it, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Thank you," she said, quickly releasing his hand. "For what?" "For standing up for me. You didn't have to do that." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "I meant what I said. You're a hard worker, Miss Parker. That's all that matters to me." As the days passed, Rose noticed a change in how the men treated her. While not exactly friendly, they had ceased their open mockery. Occasionally, she caught Ethan watching her from across the field, his expression unreadable. Whenever their eyes met, he would nod respectfully before turning away. One evening, as Rose was preparing to walk the 3 miles back to her homestead, Ethan approached on horseback. "Miss Parker, may I offer you a ride home?" he asked, his horse prancing slightly beneath him. "It'll be dark soon, and the road can be dangerous for a woman alone." Rose considered his offer. Her feet ached, and the thought of the long walk home was daunting. Still, she hesitated. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you," she said. "It's no inconvenience," he replied. "My father asked me to check on some cattle near your property anyway." Rose doubted the truth of this statement, but appreciated his attempt to spare her pride. She nodded her acceptance, and Ethan extended his hand, pulling her up behind him in one smooth motion. "Hold on," he instructed as he urged his horse forward. Rose tentatively placed her hands on his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. They rode in silence for a time, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves lulling her into a comfortable trance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. "Beautiful country," Ethan remarked, breaking the silence. "Yes," Rose agreed. "Even in drought, there's something special about it. Been here long, since I was 12. My parents moved us from Missouri after the war, said they wanted a fresh start." Rose surprised herself with how easily the words came. She rarely spoke of her family to others. "What about you?" "Born and raised here," Ethan replied. "My father established the ranch when there was nothing but wilderness, built it from nothing." "You must be proud," Rose said. "I am, though sometimes I wonder what it would be like to build something of my own." As they approached Rose's small cabin, she felt a twinge of embarrassment at its humble appearance. The whitewash was peeling, and the roof needed repair in several places. Her neglected garden showed signs of the drought's devastation. Ethan brought the horse to a stop and dismounted before helping Rose down. His hands lingered briefly at her waist before he stepped back. "Thank you for the ride," Rose said, suddenly conscious of how close they were standing. "You're welcome." Ethan glanced around the property. "Looks like your pump handle is broken," Rose sighed. "Yes, it broke last week. I've been hauling water from the creek." Without hesitation, Ethan strode over to examine it. "I can fix this for you. Do you have any tools?" "Mr. Powell, you don't need to." "Ethan," he corrected. "And I know I don't need to, but it's getting dark, and no one should be without water." Rose relented, showing him to the small shed where her father's tools were kept. She watched as Ethan worked, his capable hands making quick work of the repair. When he finished, he pumped the handle and water flowed freely. "There," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "should hold now." "I don't know how to thank you," Rose said. "No need." Ethan glanced at the sky. "I should get going before it's completely dark." As he mounted his horse, he looked down at her. "See you tomorrow, Miss Parker." "Rose," she said impulsively. "If I'm to call you Ethan, you should call me Rose." A smile touched his lips, softening his features. "Good night, Rose." As his horse trotted away, Rose stood watching until he disappeared into the gathering darkness. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than weariness settle in her chest, a strange flutter that both alarmed and intrigued her. The next morning, Rose arrived at the fields to find the men gathered in a circle, their voices raised in argument. She approached cautiously, catching fragments of their conversation. Saying we can't work with no woman ain't natural, distraction in the fields. Ethan stood at the center of the group, his expression thunderous. I don't give a damn what you think is natural. This is my father's ranch and I decide who works here. Then maybe we should talk to your father directly, challenged Wilson, emboldened by the support of his fellows. See what old man Powell thinks about having a woman doing a man's job. You're welcome to try, Ethan said coolly, but my father trusts my judgment, and I say Rose Parker stays. The use of her first name did not go unnoticed. Several men exchanged meaningful glances and Wilson's eyes narrowed speculatively. Oh, I see how it is, he said with a sneer. Boss has a soft spot for the little lady, Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. That's enough, Wilson. One more word and you're fired. Wilson opened his mouth to retort, then thought better of it and stomped away. The other men dispersed, returning to their work with muttered complaints. Rose approached Ethan hesitantly. I don't want to cause trouble, she said. Ethan's expression softened when he saw her. You're not causing anything, they are with their backward thinking. Still, if it's creating problems for you. Don't worry about me, he said firmly. I can handle Wilson and his cronies. They worked through the morning, the tension in the fields palpable. Rose could feel the resentful gazes of the other workers but kept her head high and her hands busy. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising the first real rain in months. Looks like a storm coming, Ethan announced, eyeing the sky. We'll finish this section and call it a day before it hits. The men worked with renewed energy, eager to complete their tasks before the rain. As they were packing up their tools, the first heavy drops began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened up, drenching them all. Get to shelter, Ethan called over the sudden downpour. Rose hurried toward the equipment shed, but her foot slipped in the rapidly forming mud. She fell hard, crying out as pain shot through her ankle. Before she could attempt to stand, strong arms lifted her. I've got you, Ethan said, cradling her against his chest as he carried her to the shelter of the shed. Inside, he gently set her on a wooden bench. The other workers huddled near the door, watching with undisguised interest as Ethan knelt to examine Rose's ankle. Can you move it? He asked, his hands gentle on her mud-spattered boot. Rose winced as she rotated her foot. Yes, but it hurts. Probably just a sprain. Still, you shouldn't walk on it. Ethan turned to the men. The rain's letting up. Wilson, hitch up the wagon. I'm taking Miss Parker home. Wilson scowled but moved to comply. The others whispered among themselves, casting speculative glances at Rose and Ethan. When the wagon was ready, Ethan carried Rose out despite her protests that she could manage with help. He settled her in the wagon bed, covering her with a blanket to ward off the chill of the rain. Wilson, tell my father I'll be back before sundown, Ethan instructed before climbing up beside Rose. The ride to Rose's cabin was uncomfortable as the wagon jolted over the rutted road, sending spikes of pain through her injured ankle. Ethan kept the horses at a steady pace, occasionally glancing at her with concern. Almost there, he assured her as they turned onto the narrow path leading to her homestead. Once at the cabin, Ethan again lifted Rose into his arms, carrying her inside. The cabin was neat but sparse, with simple furnishings that had seen better days. He deposited her gently on a chair near the hearth. Let me get a fire going, he said, moving to the cold fireplace. Rose watched as he efficiently laid kindling and struck a match. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, gradually growing into a comforting blaze. Thank you, she said, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. You've been very kind. Ethan shrugged off her thanks. Do you have anything to wrap that ankle with? Rose directed him to a small chest where she kept medical supplies. He returned with bandages and knelt before her once more. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her boot. At her nod, he carefully removed it, his touch causing her to wince despite his gentleness. He rolled down her stocking with clinical efficiency, revealing the swollen flesh beneath. "Definitely a sprain," he confirmed. "You'll need to stay off it for a few days." "I can't afford to miss work," Rose protested. "Your job will be waiting when you're healed," Ethan assured her as he began wrapping her ankle with practiced movements. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "You pick up a few things growing up on a ranch," he replied. "Injuries are common." When he finished, he remained kneeling before her, his eyes meeting hers. Something in his gaze made Rose's heart quicken. "Rose," he began, then hesitated. A loud knock interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Ethan rose quickly, moving to answer the door. Richard Carson, Ethan's father and owner of the Carson Ranch, stood on the porch, his imposing figure framed by the doorway. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the same piercing blue eyes as his son. "Afternoon, Miss Parker," he said, nodding to Rose before turning his attention to Ethan. "Wilson said you brought one of the workers home injured. Thought I'd check on the situation." "Just a sprained ankle, Pa," Ethan explained. "Miss Parker slipped in the mud during the storm." Richard's gaze moved between them, his expression unreadable. "I see, and you felt it necessary to bring her home yourself." "It was the right thing to do," Ethan replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. Richard stepped further into the cabin, surveying the modest surroundings. "Miss Parker, I understand you've been quite the topic of conversation among my workers lately." Rose straightened in her chair. "I apologize if my presence has caused any disruption, Mr. Carson. No need to apologize. From what I hear, you've been outworking most of my men." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's bound to ruffle some feathers." "Miss Parker needs a few days to rest her ankle," Ethan interjected. "Of course." Richard nodded. "Take the time you need, Miss Parker. Your position will be held." "Thank you, sir," Rose said, relief evident in her voice. Richard turned to his son. "It's getting late, Ethan. We should head back to the ranch." Ethan glanced at Rose, reluctance clear in his expression. "I was planning to make sure Miss Parker has everything she needs before leaving." "I'll be fine," Rose assured him, though the thought of being alone with her injury was daunting. "You've already done more than enough." Richard studied his son's face for a moment, then sighed. "I'll head back alone. You can take the wagon back when you're ready." He moved to the door, pausing to add, "Don't be too late. We have early business tomorrow." After his father left, Ethan turned to Rose. "You need food and water within reach before I go, and firewood." For the next hour, Ethan busied himself preparing for Rose's convalescence. He filled buckets with water, stacked firewood near the hearth, and even prepared a simple stew from the meager provisions in her pantry. "This should last you a couple of days," he said as he placed a bowl of the steaming stew before her. "I'll check on you tomorrow after work." "You don't have to do that," Rose protested weakly, though the thought of seeing him again brought unexpected warmth to her chest. "I know," he said simply. "I want to." As promised, Ethan returned the next evening, bringing fresh bread and a jar of preserves from the ranch kitchen. He continued his visits daily, often staying to share a meal and conversation as the sun set over the Nevada mountains. On the fourth day, Rose's ankle had improved enough that she could move around the cabin with the aid of a walking stick. Ethan arrived as usual, this time carrying a small basket of apples from our orchard, he explained as he set them on the table. "First of the season. They're beautiful," Rose said, selecting one and polishing it on her skirt before taking a bite. And delicious." Ethan watched her, a smile playing at his lips. "You have a little." He gestured to the corner of her mouth. Rose wiped at it, embarrassed. "Gone, not quite." Without thinking, he reached out, his thumb gently brushing the juice from her lower lip. The touch sent a jolt through both of them, and Ethan's hand lingered, cupping her cheek. "Rose," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath caught in her throat. Ethan, I know it's sudden, he continued, and probably improper given that you work for my father, but these past few days. He paused, searching for words. I've never met anyone like you. Rose's heart hammered in her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that I care for you, more than I should, perhaps. Before Rose could respond, the door burst open and Wilson stood in the doorway, a triumphant smirk on his face. Behind him stood Richard Carson. Ethan dropped his hand and stepped back from Rose. Pa, what are you doing here? Wilson came to me with some concerns, Richard said, his expression grave. Said you've been spending every evening here since Miss Parker's injury. I had to see for myself. Wilson's smirk widened. Told you, Mr. Carson, your son's been sweet on the field, girl. Ethan's face hardened. You had no right to spy on me, Wilson. No right. When you're favoring a woman in the fields, making the rest of us look bad, when you're sneaking around with her behind your pa's back, I'd say I had every right. Rose felt her face burn with shame and anger. Mr. Wilson, I've done nothing to deserve your malice. You've done plenty, Wilson spat. Coming in, taking a man's job, turning the boss's son's head, that's enough, Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. Wilson, wait outside. The worker hesitated, then skulked out, closing the door behind him. Richard turned to his son. Ethan, what is this about? Ethan straightened, meeting his father's gaze. It's exactly what it looks like, Pa. I care for Rose. I've been checking on her because she's injured and alone. And these feelings of yours, does Miss Parker return them? Both men looked at Rose, who felt the weight of their gazes. She glanced at Ethan, seeing the vulnerability beneath his strong exterior. I believe I do, she admitted softly, the truth of it surprising even herself. Richard's expression remained unreadable. I see. He paced the small room, hands clasped behind his back. You understand, Miss Parker, that my son stands to inherit one of the largest ranches in Nevada. His choice of companion is a matter of some consequence. Rose's heart sank. Of course, she was unsuitable, a poor farmer's daughter working in the fields. I understand, Mr. Carson. Do you? Richard asked, stopping to face her. Because my son seems to think quite highly of you, says you work harder than any man on the ranch. Says you've maintained this homestead alone since your parents passed, despite drought and hardship. Rose blinked, uncertain how to respond. Those are qualities I respect, Miss Parker: determination, resilience, pride in honest work. Richard glanced at his son. If my son has chosen to give his heart to someone, I'd rather it be a woman of character than one of mere social standing. Hope flared in Rose's chest as Ethan moved to stand beside her. Does that mean you approve, Pa? Ethan asked cautiously. It means I won't stand in your way, Richard replied, though I'd suggest a proper courtship before any permanent arrangements are discussed. He looked around the cabin. And Miss Parker, when your ankle is healed, I'd like to offer you a different position at the ranch. We need someone to manage the kitchen garden and henhouse. The pay is better than field work. That's very generous, Mr. Carson, Rose said, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Not generosity, practicality. You've proven your worth. Richard moved toward the door. Ethan, don't be too late. And Miss Parker, I expect you'll join us for Sunday dinner once you're mobile. After Richard departed, Ethan and Rose stared at each other in stunned silence before breaking into relieved laughter. Well, Ethan said, taking her hands in his. That wasn't how I planned to tell my father about us. Us? Rose asked, a smile playing at her lips. Ethan's expression grew serious. I meant what I said, Rose. I care for you deeply. These past days have only confirmed what I suspected that first day in the fields when I saw you working so determinedly despite the mockery. And what was that? She whispered. That you were someone special, someone I wanted to know. He brought her hands to his lips, kissing them gently. Someone I could love. Rose's heart swelled with emotion. I've been alone so long I'd forgotten what it feels like to have someone care. You're not alone anymore, Ethan promised, drawing her closer. If you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, as my father suggested. I'd like that very much, Rose replied, tilting her face up to his. Ethan leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, questioning kiss that deepened as Rose responded. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I should go," Ethan said reluctantly, "but I'll be back tomorrow." "I'll be waiting," Rose promised. After Ethan left, Rose stood by the window, watching his figure recede into the darkness. For so long, her life had been defined by struggle and survival. Now, unexpectedly, it held the promise of something more. Over the following weeks, Rose's ankle healed completely, and she began her new position tending the Carson Ranch's kitchen gardens. The work was less physically demanding than field labor, but no less satisfying. With her natural green thumb, the gardens flourished under her care. Ethan courted her openly, taking her on rides across the ranch's expansive lands and introducing her to the townspeople of Truckee as his Rose. The field workers, witnessing Richard Carson's approval of the relationship, ceased their mockery. Even Wilson kept his distance, though his resentful glares continued whenever their paths crossed. By the time autumn painted the Nevada landscape in gold and crimson, Ethan had built an addition to Rose's cabin and repaired its weathered exterior. They spent evenings planning improvements to her small farm, integrating her land with a portion of the Carson Ranch that Ethan's father had gifted them. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan took Rose's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice serious, "about the future, our future." Rose smiled at him. "Have you now?" "I have." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Rose's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect pearl. "It was my mother's," Ethan explained. "Pa gave it to me after he saw us together that first time, said he knew then what I was feeling." Tears welled in Rose's eyes as Ethan slid from the porch swing to kneel before her. "Rose Parker, you amaze me every day with your strength and your heart. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Ethan, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness that had grown between them. They were married in November in the small church in Truckee, with Richard Carson beaming proudly as Ethan's best man. The entire town attended, curious to witness the union of the Carson heir and the woman who had once been mocked for working in the fields. As winter settled over the valley, Rose and Ethan made their home on her family's land, now expanded and improved. The small cabin grew into a proper farmhouse, warm and inviting against the snow-covered landscape. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Rose's head resting on his shoulder. "How much has changed in 1 year," she replied. "Last winter I was alone and afraid, wondering if I would survive. Now, he prompted. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, still flat but holding their future. "Now we're a family." Ethan's eyes widened, then filled with wonder. "A baby, are you certain?" Rose nodded, her smile radiant. "Come spring, there will be 3 of us." Ethan gathered her into his arms, his joy palpable. "I love you, Rose Powell, more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "My defender, my love, my home." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the land in a pristine blanket. Inside, in the warmth of their home, Rose and Ethan embraced their future, built on the foundation of respect and love that had begun that day in the fields when a cowboy had seen past prejudice to recognize a woman's true worth. Their son, Richard Ethan Powell, was born the following May, strong and healthy like his parents. As Rose nursed him in the shade of the porch, Ethan working nearby in the fields they now tended together, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the lonely struggle to survive to the fullness of love and family, from mockery to respect, it had all begun with one man's willingness to see her true strength. And as the years passed, their family grew, their farm prospered, and their love deepened. Rose never forgot the words that had changed her life. "She works harder than any man here."